Good morning. Today's lecture will be about the decolonization process that followed World War II, with emphasis on self-determination by the colonies, the imperial hypocrisy that we saw in the Metropoles' attempts to put down the rebellions, and then several lessons that went unlearned. The main points I'll cover in my lecture today is the fact that World War II accelerated the decolonization due to the weakening of the metropoles and the rising expectations of the colonies. Also, the struggles for independence were evolutionary in time frame, but revolutionary in violence and conflict. There was also hypocrisy on the part of the metropoles in their extreme suppression of the independence movements. Also, we'll talk about the successes and failures of the decolonization process and the birth of neo-colonialism. While we are all aware there are many different positions on when World War II actually started, could go back all the way to the Versailles Treaty and the end of World War I. But for the purpose of this lecture, let's assume the proximate cause of World War II was the aggressive military actions of the Axis powers. The Axis objectives sought a new world order that readjusted imperial empires, realigned national borders, and established their dominance in a new regional hegemony. Germany obviously wanted to be supreme over Europe and the Soviet Union, Japan, Southeast Asia and the Pacific, and Italy, the Mediterranean and North Africa. Their objectives were the exploitation of conquered territories for natural resources, living space, and cheap labor. Also, to a certain degree, there was racial exploitation and ethnic cleansing. In hopes of peace, the Allies had delayed responses to the Axis intentions, and it actually took direct attacks to cause their response. China in the early 30s, England, France, and the Netherlands in early 1940, Russia mid-41, and America, of course, in December of 41. The initial successes of the Axis advances were certainly overwhelming. France and the Benelux nations were defeated and occupied in weeks. Britain then stood alone, and Russia was pushed back over 600 miles in 3 weeks. In the early phases of the war, many colonial possessions were overrun by the Axis. We had British Singapore and Malaysia in a matter of a week, the American Philippines, the Dutch East Indies, French Indochina, various North African colonies, and of course these defeats were swift and humiliating. The world was stunned by the aggressive actions of the Axis, and Churchill and FDR met in Newfoundland in August of 41 and established the Atlantic Charter. It had several principles. First, neither would seek territorial aggrandizement. There would be liberalization of international trade, freedom of the seas, international labor, economic, and welfare standards, the restoration of self-governance to all occupied territories, and very importantly, the allowing all people the right of self-determination. As the war progressed, the French and the British would develop tremendous dependency on the unoccupied colonies for their war effort. In British, they had India, they needed food, the treasury, and of course, natural resources and manpower. They conscripted over 2.5 million soldiers in the Indian Army, which was very close to the 2.9 million actual English citizens that they had conscripted. The French depended heavily on Africa for the military. They fielded over 190,000 African troops to support the Free French Army and other Allied operations. Examples are the French Senegalese Rifles, the King's African Rifles, the British West African Frontier Force, and the Force Publique. Despite the ultimate victory, the Allied metropoles were weakened tremendously by the war. There was the destruction of the homeland infrastructure caused by the tremendous bombing campaigns, food shortages, human capital shortage, a treasury depleted by war efforts, and then, of course, overwhelming debt burdens that they had to the United States for the Lend-Lease program. This created what I refer to as the colonial conundrum. The metropoles had made promises to their colonies in return for support during the war. And so the metropoles knew some form of self-government was necessary. The problem was they had a pressing need for colonial resources, cash, and labor. They needed to reconstruct the homeland, rebuild the infrastructure, they needed food for the population, and of course the colonial empire was part of their national prestige that they were hoping to restore. Of course, not wanting to lose their colonies, the British and the French made initial attempts at compromise. Both nations developed schemes that appeared to offer more independence politically and economically. The British created the British Sterling Zone, which was basically an internal trading zone with all of the Commonwealth nations. And the French did the French Economic and Social Development Fund. But in reality, both of these plans benefited the metropoles way more than the colonies, and they continued to retain control and left little for colonial development. The colonials were not settling for this and sought full independence. This was a result of attitudinal changes about themselves versus the metropole. They'd witnessed humiliating retreat and defeat of the metropole's colonial defenses. They recognized the weakened state of their rulers, and they were emboldened by their military and economic war achievements. And plus, they had heightened expectations from promises that were made and also the results of the Atlantic Charter. So the question would be, how would breakaway take place? Would it be through diplomacy or revolution? This movement for independence resulted in the collision of three major forces. First of all, the metropole's need for colonial resources and the desire to hang on, the colonial desire for self-determination and self-rule, mixed with the third force, the internal colonial conflicts. There were disputes based on race, religion, politics, tribal rivalries. In India, had the Muslims versus the Hindus, princes that wanted to hang on to their principalities. In Africa, tribal conflicts, all of which created disharmony on the local level. As these independent movements gained momentum, there was swift and brutal repression by the metropoles. It seems as though the commitment to the Atlantic Charter was outweighed by post-war economic exigencies. Military presence and forces were beefed up. There was conscription on the home front. The colonial forces were added to their forces, which was mostly minorities, and they used them to maintain order. And this, of course, just poured fuel on the fire, and consequently violence erupted. Apparently, the metropoles unlearned some of the lessons from the Second World War, because the wars they fought for decolonization had very high death tolls and were referred to as dirty wars. The French in Madagascar killed 80,000 indigents who revolted. In Algeria, they killed at least 1,500, and eventually this led to an 8-year war. The British in Malaya used over 300,000 troops to quell a rebellion by 8,000 rebels. And the Dutch in Indonesia used 140,000 troops plus Strooptroepen to kill over 100,000 in their largest ever military campaign. To summarize this hypocrisy, the Brits ignored the Atlantic Charter. The French and the Dutch fought harder, fiercer, and longer in the colonial wars than they did versus the Nazis in World War II. Who knows, if they had fought as hard then, they might not have been occupied. But all of them used method and actions that they had declared anathema and fought to eradicate in World War II. Ultimately, these colonies achieved nation-state status, but unfortunately it led to a new situation that can be referred to as neo-colonialism. I call it meet the new boss, same as the old boss. These new nation-states were dependent on their former metropoles and other powers for economic support. The Cold War was in full bloom between Russia and the United States, and this was tending to force these nations to join into either an East-West alignment process. Although there was an effort by Marshal Tito to create a non-aligned movement called NAM in 1961, it didn't really get tremendous traction. So these nations had to borrow money. The International Monetary Fund was involved. World Bank was involved. The Metropoles, other powers, loans were made, interest accumulated, development did not occur as expected, and so there was a deep bondage that developed here. I refer to it as the chainless bondage of debt. There were NGOs, non-government organizations, that tried to help, but they were staffed by former imperialists, so their motives were certainly at odds. In closing, we can sum this up in the adage of the tale of two cities, or one of triumph and tragedy. The triumph concerned the concept of self-determination and nation-state creation, which was finally realized and ultimately supported by the United Nations. The tragedy was the process was long and rife with violence, internal conflicts, corruptions, and many of these new nations experiencing economic and political instability right up to this current day. The final chapter has yet to be written, as the countries of the Third World still continue their existential struggles. And through the process of globalization, their conflict is being seen and experienced by all of us around the world. There's poverty, there's starvation, civil unrest, and even global terrorism. This problem is not just for the Third World countries, it's for all of us, and we're going to have to come up with solutions to help these nations become politically, socially, and economically stable. Thank you. These dirty wars waged by the Metropoles extended for many years. As I said, the use of shock troops that were expert in terrorism, the concept of summary executions, imprisonments, aggressive interrogations, suspension of civil rights, and massive relocations. Things that they hid and kept under cover for many years.